It is the coldest of hot takes. Hamas was laying a trap and goading Israel to invade. Israel must avoid the trap that has been laid. Seriously, the number of trap-based headlines would make even Admiral Akbar blush. And it is not that these points are wrong. They are just obvious, like the war equivalent of child's play. Policymakers broadly aligned with Israel are even talking about it right now. And the general point has always been obvious, going back centuries. You cannot win a fight against an insurgency without the support of the population, or at least the reluctant acceptance of the population. Thus, heavy-handed countermeasures are a risky gamble. Light countermeasures might be able to eliminate a small portion of the opposition. In contrast, going hard will allow you to get more of them. But this comes at the risk of greater civilian casualties, the elimination of any viable economic opportunities, and generally upsetting the population so much that more of them join the cause, which ultimately puts you in a worse position. This is indeed a fundamental problem that Israel faces with Hamas in Gaza. With a population of about 2.4 million people, and about 365 square kilometers big, as a hypothetical country, it would rank third in population density to just Monaco and Singapore. If the numbers are not good enough, a flyover gives you the right impression. It is humanity basically all the way through. And indeed, insurgency is the right way to think about a war between Hamas and Israel. This is not going to resemble a traditional war, with armies lined up on either side of a battlefield, as we are seeing in Ukraine. Hamas has been the de facto sovereign entity over the Gaza Strip since it narrowly won an election in 2006 and subsequently dispatched rival political party Fatah in a civil war of sorts in 2007. But the geography and distribution of conventional power are not favorable for Hamas to engage in traditional battlefield exchanges. Thus, you have Hamas favoring non-traditional insurgency techniques, with plenty of urban combat. More broadly, Hamas fighters will blend into the population and make it difficult for Israel to figure out who to target, or force Israel to inflict significant collateral damage if it opts for a less discretionary approach. For this video, let's set aside concerns about international law. Now, they are present, and I do not wish to discount them, especially when you ask 1 million people to evacuate within 24 hours. But there is a different trade-off that I want to focus on today. A deeper problem with the less discretionary approach is the Hydra Effect. You cut off one head, and 2 more grow back. Here, if Israel were to oversee a bunch of civilian casualties to eliminate just one member of Hamas, other Palestinians may become radicalized, particularly the friends and family of the deceased. Obviously, this would be a bad outcome for Israel, and this concern is the impetus for all of those news articles from earlier. But the dynamics of the situation mean that Israel faces a larger headache. Do you see the perverse incentive this gives to insurgent groups? If you can bait your opponent into an onerous response, and latent civilian sympathies broadly align with your cause, you may end up stronger than you started. In turn, committing a very provocative attack, say a surprise operation that deliberately targets civilians, begins to sound like a clever, if perverse, strategy. What I just described is probably not earth-shaking news to you. The general principle is known as provocation, and it is basically impossible to take a class on political violence and not get inundated with readings on the subject. And yet, commentators love pretending like this is some sort of deep thought worth pontificating on. It is not. On the elevator of political violence knowledge, it is level 1. Welcome to the lobby. Everyone in Israel who has an important say in the matter has known about provocation for decades. The same is true for policymakers worldwide. And yet, overreactions just keep happening. Again, I am not talking about this in the sense of international frustration over civilians being harmed. At least we could chalk that up to the general problem of anarchy in international relations. What I mean is that the overreactor ends up shooting itself in the foot. The poster child for this among the current generation of policymakers is how the United States handled the insurgency in Iraq. Mission accomplished turned out to be far from it, and it would take years before the so-called Hearts and Minds campaigns cooled the situation. Speaking about this in retrospect, Paul Bremer, who administered Iraq in 2003 and 2004, between Saddam Hussein and the new government, once said that the great challenge is to find the balance between overreacting and showing the opponent that you are not going to take provocative actions sitting down. Actually, I just lied to you. He said that at 12:22 p.m. on September 11, 2001. He knew about the problem going into Iraq because everyone did, and yet we ended up with heavy-handed approaches that did not look so smart in retrospect anyway. Indeed, this concern in part motivated Israel's mow the grass strategy that was common prior to 2023. Militant strength would grow over time, and Israel would periodically engage in operations to cut it down, hence the analogy. Of course, these operations still entailed civilian deaths and some level of Hydra effects. The point is that they were less heavy-handed than something like an occupation, which would come with much greater risks. So instead of adopting the philosophy of, hey, policymakers, don't be dumb, maybe we should start considering that selecting the right strategic balance is actually, difficult. And again, to be clear here, I do not mean the best balance in terms of minimizing civilian casualties, in some sort of humanitarian or international justice sense. The answer to that question is simple. Restrict yourself to basic police actions. But for us to understand the world around us, rather than merely think about the world we might wish to live in, we are confronted with the fact that state preferences are not always aligned with those goals. As a general reminder, the purpose of this channel is not to talk about politics, but rather what the latest political science research can tell us about current politics. The reason that even optimizing self-interest alone is so difficult is because insurgencies act strategically so that it is not easy. If I may go back to pretending to be a respectable social scientist for a second, let me explain. A country like Israel does not know exactly whether the latent sympathies among the civilian population are strong or are weak, essentially whether the Hydra problem is massive or is manageable. In contrast, groups like Hamas, who live and interact with its own civilians on a daily basis, have a much better understanding of the pulse of the population. When Hamas knows that sympathies run deep, then a provocative attack sounds like a great plan. At worst, it gets to commit the attack, and Israel is deterred from doing much in response, limited to police actions like finding and clearing smuggling tunnels. And at best, it baits Israel into letting the Hydra Effect run rampant, which makes it stronger than when it started. But insurgent groups often do not have the luxury of being so robust to countermeasures. If so, a dilemma sets in. If Israel were to choose restraint, then a weak Hamas would still like to commit the attack, because it can mostly get away with it. But if Hamas knew that Israel would deploy strong countermeasures afterward, it would be deterred from making the provocative attack. How does this weaker type of Hamas resolve its dilemma? Fortunately, Past Will has an answer to that question. Thanks, Past Will. Think of this like a bluff at a poker table. You cannot always bet with weak hands. If you do, your opponent will just call you every time, and soon you will be out of chips. At the same rate, though, it would be a bad idea to never bluff. If you only went in with strong hands, your opponent would always fold in response. But then bluffing has no downside risk. Thus, sometimes you should bluff with weak hands, and sometimes you should concede defeat. It is the same story for a weaker type of Hamas. Sometimes it would want to bluff strength with the provocative attack. Sometimes it would want to just stay home. Now think about this from Israel's perspective. All it has observed is an attack. It does not know whether a weak Hamas has committed it, or a robust Hamas has committed it. Well, the weak type sometimes chooses to bluff, and sometimes does not. When it does so optimally, it makes the opponent exactly unsure what to do. In other words, the expected benefits of destroying the weak provocateur are exactly offset by the expected downside of the Hydra Effect against a strong provocateur. Facing the uncertainty, the opponent then sometimes engages in the onerous response to deter further bluffing from the weaker type. But whenever the provocateur was actually strong, the strategy backfires. We get overreaction not because the opponent is dumb, but rather because the potential for bluffs has put it in a confusing situation. Zooming out, the meta problem here is intelligence. If Israel knows what the true latent sympathies look like, because its intelligence can differentiate between the two possibilities, then it can adopt the correct countermeasures. In essence, you cannot be bluffed if you are looking at your opponent's hole cards. But just knowing things is easier said than done. Indeed, part of the problem that started this was Israel wrongly betting that the bigger threat was in the West Bank, that Hamas had lost interest in continued conflict with Israel, and that its broader security system was up to the task. The type of intelligence problem in question here is different than all of these, because it focuses on how Palestinian civilians feel. Thus, this is a civilian human intelligence, or HUMINT issue, which does not cleanly map onto the earlier issues. In turn, the earlier failure of Israel's intelligence apparatus does not imply further failures, and the HUMINT part means that the organizational responsibility has a different weighting than the previous questions. It is also possible that the United States had better intel heading into this, and also has better HUMINT coverage. But credibly sharing that intelligence with Israel is not so simple. Yes, Washington has a long-term relationship with Tel Aviv. However, the United States also has a long-term interest in having stability in the region. In turn, the US may wish to push for a moderate response, no matter what its intel says. The bottom line is that this can be a tough egg to crack. Indeed, Russia miscalculating how Ukrainian citizens would respond to Russia's invasion was a major part of what sent the Kremlin down the wrong road. But if you want to be sent down the right road of professional social science analysis, with not-so-professional animations, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. Okay, we should talk a little more about last time. First things first, we crossed 500,000 subscribers. That is awesome, and I thank you so much for that. Meanwhile, I knew that switching subjects away from Ukraine would be a new experience, but I was not fully prepared for this. There was a bizarre fascination in the comments with this flag from the thumbnail. Specifically that I had the wrong one, that this was Saudi Arabia's flag. This is despite the fact that Saudi Arabia's actual flag appeared later in the video. In fairness, it is worth noting that Hamas has many flags, and this is the one I just so happened to use. And although I know this comment was not made in good faith, it is generally reasonable to ask why I am not using the Palestinian flag. The short answer is that Palestinian areas cover 2 regions, and Hamas is a militant/political party that controls just one of them. Currently, Israel is only at war with Hamas, and thus it does not make sense to use the Palestinian flag. I also joked that war stands for "we are right," a phrase that dates back millions of years. Rather than treat this as a bit of hyperbole, I did get a kick out of how many comments took this seriously. In actuality, this was a reference to an obscure 1990s TV show called Dinosaurs, a bizarre sitcom about, well, anthropomorphic dinosaurs, hence the image that was sitting in the background. In one particular episode, four-legged dinosaurs go to war with two-legged dinosaurs over the supply of pistachios. Peace, of course, stood for Pistachio Eaters Against the Chief Elder. It turns out it was all one odd allegory for the Gulf War. That being said, I often do learn a lot from your comments. I am only one man, and I do get things wrong. Case in point, I mentioned that failure of imagination was being used as an explanation for why Israeli intelligence failed to anticipate the Hamas attack, and that the phrase dates back to the 9/11 Commission report. In fact, it dates back to at least the Apollo 1 disaster. You learn something new every day.